All right. So we are presenting on the second part of chapter 2 today of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality by Dr. Bhimadevapuri, the serving director of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute. And so we're here at Stockton University in Galloway with the Science of Life Club. Abhi Sheikh is here, and I'm Krishna Keshava. And we're here with Alex, a good friend and alumni of the club. We're happy to be able to do this again. So let's see. How do you want to really know this work? Okay, here we go. So we have some book reviews here that we're not going to read them right now, but they're from some scholars, one professor from here at Stockton, a professor of psychology who's our faculty advisor. And like we did last time, I'd like to just do a review of the first chapter real quick. So basically, we want to discuss why reductionism is not a good way to study reality, to study nature, especially biology or human beings, because reductionism doesn't give us scope to study consciousness, decision-making, purpose-oriented phenomena like functions of organs or functions of, even in a social functional context. Reductionism doesn't give us scope to think about those things because it says everything is just atoms and molecules. So Dr. Puri has given this very nice example to sum up, a lesson for that kind of limited approach, why reductionism is limited. So he says, consider a book. We have a book here, and at the first level, it's just paper, ink, and glue, right?
Paper,
ink, and glue, yeah. That does describe the book to some extent, but it doesn't give us a very full description of the book. So then we can also think of it as an aggregate of letters and sentences, right? But still, that doesn't give us a full description of what the book actually is, because the book is about a particular topic. It's communicating a certain message. So the words by themselves, or the paper and the glue by themselves, are not enough to describe the book in total. You need, what is the message of the author? What is the purpose behind the book? What ideas are they trying to communicate? That gives you a fuller idea of what the book is. So similarly, we have on the screen here, the mechanical aspect is basically the paper and ink. The chemical aspect are the letters, but the biological aspect is the conceptual aspect, or the purpose-oriented aspect, where it gives you a very broad idea. So when we're in nature, we need to be able to study purposes, not just the molecules. That's the basic takeaway from this analogy. So then we'll just move on. And then a summary of the second chapter, the first part of the second chapter that we had. Basically, we talked about the theistic inspiration underpinning modern science, how Newton's Lord God Pantocrator, a universal ruler, was needed in Newton's worldview to describe for the stability of the solar system why there weren't more collisions between planets. A mechanical model doesn't give scope for why collisions don't happen. There'd be more chaos in the solar system if it was just mechanical, random chance governing the movement of the solar system. So he thought there needs to be some kind of an intelligence which is maintaining an order. And we gave the example of like a sandcastle. A sandcastle will never appear if you throw sand in the air. You have to intelligently build it. It takes ordering, and that means intelligence. So similarly, all these purposeful creations in nature that are keeping patterns consistently over long periods of time, randomness doesn't account for that. Randomness doesn't give you order. Randomness gives you disorder. So we talked about that and how science itself is based on the intelligibility of nature, which is a theistic presumption that there is reason in nature, and humans can understand that reason and study it. Atheists don't, we can see by the atheists who are scientists today, they don't believe that purpose is a real thing. They don't believe that that consciousness or intelligence is a fundamental aspect of nature. They think it's just a random, complex, emergent property after the material building blocks are given enough time to mutate and transform based on random chance. So there's no reason for someone who thinks like that to have an assumption that nature is purposeful and you can learn what those purposes are about. So we find that the founders of modern science were all theists, from Aristotle to Descartes and Francis Bacon, Newton, even Galileo. They were all theists, and their inspiration to study nature was to learn what the intelligent design plans were that, basically were underlying nature, that God was intelligent and there was a blueprint in nature, and that blueprint of God could be learned through empirical study of nature. So these were some topics we discussed. And then we ended with discussing the distinguishing between models and truth. That science right now just gives us models that are based on how nature appears to our consciousness. But that's just, those models are based on an appearance of nature to our consciousness, and they don't account for what nature is in itself, independent of our consciousness of it. So in order to study what nature is or reality is independent of our finite consciousness, we need to utilize philosophical approaches and religious approaches, because the point of religion, for instance, is to provide a worldview which is beyond the finite human capacity. So when we start with that, which is beyond human capacity, and then we can arrive at human capacity from that, then we have a broader perspective of what reality is. It's not just limited to human experience. Rather, we're finding the context within which human experience is occurring. And that's more about what we'll talk about today. So while chapter 1 addressed the complementarity of science and philosophy, chapter 2 establishes the relevance of religion to science and philosophy. So now we'll continue with part 2 of chapter 2. The first topic we'll discuss is the theistic development of conceptualizing whole-part relations. So the second half of this chapter starts with a quote from René Descartes that says, "Cogito ergo sum," or "I think, therefore I am." This statement, which is very famous, some consider the starting point of modern philosophy. This is claiming that thought is a product of an I, or a finite self. We're given a very different perspective from Hegel, who was in the world about 200 years after Descartes. He said that thought is only true in proportion as it sinks itself into the facts, and in point of form, it is no private act of the subject. So this is suggesting that thought is beyond the I. Not that thought is a product of the I, but that it is beyond the I, and perhaps even how I is a product of thought. So we'll go a little deeper into what Descartes was saying. So first we'll start with this excerpt from the book. Dr. Madhavapuri says, "I think puts all important power of thinking in the I. Not only that, but it also establishes the absolute being of the I. However, if we try to determine how it is that we perform this amazing activity of thinking, we draw a blank. If I don't know how to do it, then the certainty that I do it should at least seem dubitable." So before we go deeper into what Dr. Puri is saying here, let's just, carefully unpack Descartes' statement. I think, therefore I am. So he's saying he's starting with I, his finite self, and he's saying I think, so thought is coming from the I, and because he's thinking, he's saying I'm existing. So he's saying I produces thought, and because thought is there, he can be certain that he's existing. So this is also saying that existence is dependent upon the I. That's why Dr. Porter mentions it establishes the absolute being of the I. So this can become problematic, and we'll discuss why that's the case. So, as Dr. Porter said, if we can't explain how we're doing something, in a very comprehensive way, in a very straightforward way, then it's very questionable that we are the ones doing it. So now we're talking about thinking. Descartes claims that the thought is coming from the I. But if we want to make that claim in a concrete way, then we have to be able to explain, when did I start thinking? Why did I start thinking? How did I start thinking? All right, all these questions we have to be able to answer. But, we cannot trace that. Thinking, we have some capacity to direct thought, no doubt, and to develop it in a certain way through education. But thinking itself has always been going on, right? Since we were young. We never decided to start thinking. It has developed along with us, and it continues to exist even when we're not in a waking state, right? Even when we're sleeping, dreaming is going on, thought is still going on. So this is an activity that's happening to us, happening through us, not coming from us. We're experiencing thought. But this is what seems to be a more rational consideration of the relationship between thought and the self. Thought is happening through the self, not that it's coming from the self. So this kind of gets us closer to what Hegel was hinting at, that thought is not a private act. It's not something within the confines of an I. It's much broader and more universal than that. So now we'll dive a little more into the dilemma of self-centered thinking. What this I, when we say I, what do we really mean by I? We use the word so often, right? The concept so often, but what do we really mean by it? So I refers to oneself as different and separate from something or someone else. I think means thought is understood as a private act within one's own mind. This causes an individual to think of himself as separate and isolated from the rest of reality, such that they can have their own private thoughts about the external world. A mood of superiority arises when one believes that they can think whatever they want about reality without consequences. I gives rise to mine, and people claim possession of whatever they're able to. But when two people want the same thing and can't share or compromise, violence emerges, so there is a consequence. So since self-centered thinking is self-destructive, it becomes necessary to contextualize the self as a part or participant in something beyond itself. This is not an artificial imposition, but unfolds naturally through careful contemplation of what I really implies. So now the next slides, we're going to dive deeper into what I can refer to, which takes us beyond this immediate self-centered conception of I that seems to be predominant in the world right now. Before I continue, Alex, did you have any input, or do you think this is a decent representation of what most people refer to I, or do you maybe disagree, or what do you think?
No, this is really interesting because I had this conversation with my friend yesterday, exact conversation. And it started with what is thought? And who is the one experiencing thought? Because I think if we can find that out or come to a consensus or something, what I is, I think then we can maybe see what thought is in that context. And I like how you said thought is not something that is produced by us, but it's something that is working through us or is experienced by us. That's kind of where I think, well, I stand for sure with that. But if I could stand anywhere, but I've always been fascinated by this, so I'm just kind of locked in, writing some stuff down. That's it.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear that this is connecting with what you were just doing yesterday. It's
Yep,
almost like reaffirming that, like we're in the right place together. We're doing the right thing here,
exactly. It really is, man. Yep.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to move forward, Abhishek. All right. Okay. So the next consideration is the I that is we and the we that is I. This is something that comes from Hegel's philosophy. So everyone refers to themselves as I. So even though one means themselves by I, they're actually referring to everyone who calls themselves I. I turns out to have a universal aspect to it and not just an individual aspect. So we can also call that universal I or the universal self, we can refer to it as we on some level. Because when we say we mean the same thing as I in the sense that I'm including myself. But we're not just talking about ourselves on an individual level, we're talking about ourselves in connection to others. So we're identifying, it's like an agreement among many I's that they're all identifying themselves with the group, with the collective. So it's a universal form of I. The individual is still included in the universal, but that universal goes beyond just the individual. So we will explore this more here. So I turns out to have a universal aspect to it and not just an individual. And there are nuances to the interrelationship between I and we. From one perspective, as conscious individuals, the collective is represented internally in our awareness and not just externally. So not only am I identifying with the group of people that seem external to myself, but I have an idea of that collective within my consciousness. There's a representation of it in my mind. And in that sense, the collective is within me, that we is within the I. But as we already described before, the I is also within the we. So this is why Hegel says the we that is I and the I that is we. The whole and the part are irreducibly interconnected. One does not exist without the other. The part doesn't exist without the whole, and the whole doesn't exist without the part. I never exists independently and isolated from a context. And at the same time, we, a collective, doesn't exist without the particular participants of that collective. It's an interrelationship. So another perspective of this interrelationship that Dr. Madhavapuri points out is how the collective has shaped the individual in so many ways, right? The experiences we have in a society that shape the way we think or the way we feel, the lessons that we've learned from so many teachers and friends and people who might not be our friends, but taught us something anyway. So the individual never exists in isolation. So we're trying to get away from that idea. This isolation and false independence becomes very problematic, and it causes so many problems in so many fields of knowledge, and not only in fields of knowledge, but our own direct experience. It becomes very isolating and can, mess with our mental health in some way and has many repercussions. And that isn't to take away from our individuality. It just means that the individual is not alone and never is alone. And that can become a very empowering lesson, and it's also a very humbling lesson. It can also be a very humbling lesson. So the universal, now we're going to transition to really talk about the relationship between individual and universal. The universal is not arbitrary or impotent. It possesses the potency of the individual, yet it surpasses it. So if you look at some philosophy, some folks try to spin that universals are just a concoction of the mind and they don't really exist. But that's not the case, and we'll see why that is in a moment. So as far as people who like to use reductionism say that there is no whole, it's just the sum of the parts are the real thing. They might think that a we is nothing but a sum of people. It's really the individuals who have the power, and the we is just kind of an arbitrary idea that we add on to this, these individuals. But an individual has never created a nation, right? So we have in the Declaration of Independence, it starts with "we the people," right? In order to form a more perfect nation.
It's called a preamble.
Preamble, exactly, the preamble, yeah. You're right, it's in the preamble. But it uses that word "we," it's not just George Washington or not just Benjamin Franklin, or the guy who made our university, right? Richard Stockton, he was also a Declaration of Independence signer. None of these individuals had the capacity to do something so great as an isolated individual, only by tapping into the power of the reality of the universal, of a collective. I should say the collective aspect of a universal, because there's more to a universal than just a collective. But anyhow, for this country example, they need to tap into that power of the collective in order to do something so profound as to create a nation that is, based on the principle of freedom, very high principle in its pure form. So the fundamental logical structure of every concept is actually including both individual or singular aspect and the universal aspect. But more than that, it's a triadic structure. There's three elements. It's universal, particular, and singular. This is something Hegel deals with in a very comprehensive way. You can also call it genus, species, or specimen. The biological nomenclature of different species. It also follows this kind of pattern. So universal, particular, and singular. And we can find the example of how that manifests in very familiar concepts, such as we, as just discussed, also with trees, fruits, and animals, which we'll get into now. Yeah, and Alex, if you want, anytime, just please feel free to butt in if you want to, but I'll just keep going.
I was just gonna ask, and you might have already kind of touched on this, but is the I sense something that can be like quantifiable, or is the I sense like an experiential phenomenon purely? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Alex. So the I is so quantifying something is an experiential exercise.
Right.
So the I is the more basic idea is experience, and then within experience, we try to grapple with where we are by quantifying things or not quantifying things. So it's all in experience, in the experience of consciousness. But to kind of go deeper into that question, the I, who or what we relate to, is really based on our heart, right? The I can mean just me alone, even though individuals are never isolated. Nonetheless, so many people can have a conception of themselves that is isolated from everything, and they feel themselves, very kind of alone or something. So that's their subjective experience. That is how they're identifying themselves. But an I can also be something very wide. Someone who identifies themselves, for instance, with a nation or a religious community. Their notion of themselves becomes very wide. Right? People are willing, from the armed forces, their notion of self is so wide that they're willing to die for their country. So it becomes a very broad thing, and that's actually even relevant in biological study, where people like this biologist in Boston named Michael Levin, who came to our conference last year. He discussed that cancer is the result of a cell who is normally multicellular, basically forgetting its role in the collective, and its notion of I becomes very small, and it starts acting as a unicellular. So it starts becoming very destructive in the biological whole. And so this kind of mode of inquiry is causing them to now ask, well, how can we remind it of its multicellularity? How can we get it to expand its concept of self back to the whole organism? So
Do you think that's something that's happening at like a macrocosm level, like in terms of human beings forgetting the I sense, and it's causing us to, be disattached from the whole, and it's individuating us, and it's causing violence? Do you think there's something to be said for that, or am I just reading too much?
No, Alex,
Yeah.
you're reading the future, because that's like in a slide that's coming in 5 slides. But yeah, exactly. Because and we'll try in the slides. We try to present the like stepwise development of how to get to that idea. But exactly, it's that forgetfulness of the connection with the whole that is causing all of the problems. It's the cancer of our social body, right? So if a single cell that forgets its connection to the whole causes cancer in a biological sense, in a social sense or spiritual sense, our forgetfulness of connection with the whole is what's causing the cancer of our current world, of all the fighting and the quarreling and the wars and all that.
Wow. So I'm just gonna go a little further, just because this is on my mind. I don't want to forget. But do you think if there were to be a goal of experience, or of a purpose, maybe, do you think it would be to return to that I sense, or is purpose subjective? I know, you know what I mean? Is there an
Yeah,
overarching purpose to life? And would that be something like a logical step to take, and to say, well, because we've been so disattached, we haven't been rewarded for that. So what we are rewarded when we feel like we are like a conglomerate. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. So there's two aspects. We have to remember the two aspects of the I, the individual and the universal. And that universal I, or the universal self, as we'll describe in a couple slides, the universal self is not just the collective. It's right, just like in the body, the cells are, as an organism, we have our own individual self-consciousness, even though we're composed of cognitive cells. We're not just the collective of cells. We have our own self-consciousness as an individual. So at the same time, reality, the universal self, is also self-conscious. And that's what the concept of God is that so self-conscious
right,
has a self-conscious identity as the absolute. um, and so that's the non-sectarian view or purpose of what religious inquiry is supposed to be aimed at, is how to rekindle that consciousness of our connection to the whole for the purposes of the whole. And that's
right,
what these methods of philosophy, which is it's not supposed to be some contingent speculative process. It's supposed to be the development of reason, which is based on necessity. Thought can develop of its own accord based on the necessity inherent in thought already. And the human form of life has the capacity to experience that necessity and be guided through that development of reason, which is not it has no source in any individual self, but the individual self can tap into that and go through that development to kind of be reminded of how it's connected to the whole. That's what Hegel's project was all about. The development of the absolute idea through logic, his encyclopedia of logic, encyclopedia of nature, and then finally the encyclopedia of spirit. So, and that's also in the East what the process of bhakti yoga is about, or Krishna consciousness. It's about rekindling that purpose of being a part in the whole in a super practical way, on a daily way. What is our mindset? How to think about our environment and how we relate to our environment and other individuals in that environment, and how this is all being directed and what to do, what not to do based upon, the degree to which the other individuals we find ourselves surrounded with are, acting for the whole or not acting for the whole, and how that affects us negatively or positively. And that's the whole, that's the whole point. It's a very deep, very important thing, and that's what we're trying to think about in a scientific way. Not just in a sentimental way, but what is this? How do we think about it? How do we act?
I was just gonna say, like, is logic required a required element of searching, or can maybe not be sentimental, but is there another way to connect with that instead of through reason and logic, which I know it's an important part, but I'm just thinking for people that might not have the capacity to do so with with what they're given, can they still reason to God in some sense? You know what I mean? Just
from the perspective of the Vedanta or Bhakti in the East, that's what the process of yoga is about the practicing the association of individuals who are already on that platform and engaging in the kinds of meditation and through mantra meditation and through the more disciplined lifestyle. That's what that process is for. That process is more on the feeling level rather than the thinking level. Although those both levels are connected to each other, they're not independent of each other. The emphasis there is more on the feeling side, under the guidance of someone who has already developed that. That's what the purpose of taking shelter of a bona fide teacher is all about. They can help guide us through. Not that we're alone trying to feel or reason, but rather that we're being guided in that direction through the age.
Because feeling can also be a misguidance, right? Not to cut you off. I just think a feeling can misguide us. So it's helpful to have people on your path to say that's not a thought. That's not coming from your materialistic view of life and how you've been indoctrinated through materialism to think this is truth. And then that person would tell you that. And it would have to be someone who's, like you said, a bona fide teacher. And so that makes sense to me. That actually, thank you for explaining that. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And so the goal of what we're trying to talk about in this part of the presentation, we call it the theistic development of conceptualizing whole part relations, is to kind of solidify, what is that rational basis for this? What is the rational basis for seeing that, from a religious perspective, that the will of God is in everything. Not so even when we're feeling most alone, if we can try to remember that we aren't alone, and we can try to remember that everything is all right, and that we're not in control, not in a way that makes us panic, but in a way that gives us actually relief, because someone who cares and loves for us is in control and trying to help guide us away from misconception and towards a more comprehensive, proper conception. So that's, we're trying to give a rational basis for why that's the case and how we can think about that in a way that's not just sentimental.
Yeah. And I think maybe for a lot of people it's necessary to like dig themselves out of that hole through logic. And that's what I found that very useful. I mean, I thought it used to be, my path used to be like all about feeling and meditation and deep connection, which I would say, in my experience, it brings me the closest to where I want to be in terms of like, in terms of where I think I should be morally and ethically, and it fills me with joy. But there's some aspects that are fleeting, and I think that logic kind of irons it out in some sense and makes it more clear. And so, yeah, I'd really appreciate you answering that, man. That was great. That helped me a lot. I've been thinking about that specifically for the last week and a half. That has actually been the number one thing in my head. So I'm glad it came up.
Wonderful. Yeah. So now but getting back to the slide here, how to conceptualize what this triadic structure of every concept, what is, the necessity of that. So in nature, we see trees, or we see any individual object, but that object is a kind. It's not just, it's connected to kinds that are similar to it. And then we have different groups of objects. So when we say this is an oak tree, there's a lot there actually. Just like when we say I, but we actually refer to every other person who calls himself I. When we say that oak tree, we're actually talking about every oak tree. Language cannot really articulate the singular. It can only articulate the particular or universal. We just know what each other means when we say that, so we ignore those nuances. But those nuances are important. Language itself is more on the universal platform. Our direct sense experience is more less refined than that language. So when we say an oak tree, every oak tree that we see with our eyes falls under the category of oak tree. But every oak tree falls under the category of tree, such that there are different kinds of trees: spruce trees, palm trees, apple trees. So that means there's something common between oak trees, spruce trees, pine trees, apple trees, but there's also something different. So there's a conceptual structure there that is both unifying these things and also differentiating these things. And when we can't see that, we can only access it through thought.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in fact, this aspect of thought, this universal aspect, which is both unifying and differentiating these things that we're seeing with our senses, that's what's more fundamental. Because if one oak tree is chopped down or dies, or if somehow the entire species of oak trees were to go extinct, there'd still be all the spruce trees, all the pine trees, all the apple trees, all the palm trees. So tree would still exist. So it's not that the universal is dependent upon the singular in that sense, right? Mm-hmm. The universal can exist even when the singular has disappeared. The universal still persists. So conceptual thinking, thought, is actually, more permanent, is more on the eternal platform than the passing, fleeting things that we see with our eyes or experience with our senses. So that pattern continues to go up, right? As we get more universal, then all those trees are actually plants. And there are different kinds of plants. There are trees and shrubs and flowers, which have all different particular kinds of flowers, azaleas, daffodils, and then the actual flowers we experience in, in nature with our senses. So this is a specimen. The specimen is what we experience with our senses, and that specimen belongs to a particular species, and that species is under a genus, a more general. And as we go up that conceptual ladder, it becomes more general, or less determined, we should say, because it's still a very it's a distinguished idea. Of course, plant is not just a general idea. It's different from animal, or different from the different kingdoms of life that exist. All right, we have fungi, plant, animal, protozoa, all those kinds. So plant is still different from animals and fungi, but that difference exists on the conceptual plane, not just in the empirical sensuous plane. So in this way, we can also say that life is beyond death, right? Even if we pass away, or an oak tree passes away, life still persists. So even if one doesn't necessarily believe that there is a soul, nonetheless, conceptually, life survives after death. Life is a concept, not just a specimen existing physically. So we also are a part of, human beings are a part of this conceptual structure. But we have a very unique role. We can ask, we can reflect on it, right? Trees or animals, they can't reflect on that conceptual structure. Although they are cognitive, they can make decisions to maximize survival or maximize pleasure. They have cognitive capacities in that way, but they don't have metacognition or self-reflective cognition. They can't ask, what is life, or who am I? That's something very special to humanity. So this is also worth pointing out, right? Humans are not just another form of life. They're a very, very special form of life. And when thought is used properly, in connection with the whole can benefit. The whole benefits from that. So we can also look at this whole thing from a different perspective. Mathematics. Mathematics has set theory. In a set theory, you have a set, a subset, and then an individual item. So the set is like the universal, the most broad, a tree. Then subsets of trees are oak trees and spruce trees. And then the individual items are the specimens you find before you. So, this is another way to look at it. This is showing how fundamental this kind of triadic structure of thought is. Not only from a philosophical perspective, but a mathematical perspective, it's also there. Right? So we just have here a picture showing its more mathematical application. Natural numbers is a subset of integers. Integers are -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, but natural numbers are just positive integers, 1, 2, 3. And items, each of the individuals are items. So in the same way, bears and birds are subsets of animals. Americans and scientists are subsets of humans. One is a nationality, one is occupation. You can categorize people differently. So now we're trying to cultivate, what is a deeper conception of the I that allows us to, get beyond that isolated, independent idea, right? So the I is self-consciousness. The concept of I means self-consciousness, right? I means that it's a self-referential. It takes oneself as an object of thought. When I say I'm acknowledging myself as an individual, or I'm acknowledging certain aspects of myself. So it's not just that I'm acting as an individual. Any animal, any form of life acts as an individual, right? They take from the environment what they need to sustain their life, but they don't have a concept of themselves. Like we just said, only humans have a concept of themselves and can try to inquire about that. And that's what leads to philosophy, science, religion, social structures, nations, states, even art, all different forms of arts, all the humanities. This is all motivated by this self-consciousness that human beings possess. And the I is self-consciousness. That's what the I means. So if we take that further now, it logically follows that the universal I, or we, the universal self, also possesses this property of self-consciousness, because the items or subsets where the individual I is an item or subset of the set, which is the universal self, that means anything inside the experience of the individual I is existing in the broader context of the universal I. That means the universal self is also self-conscious. It's not just an aggregate of individuals, but is a whole unto itself. It is the set within which subsets of individuals exist and derive their properties. So how does this self-consciousness practically manifest in collectives like teams, governments, and organisms? So logically, we can follow if the individual is self-conscious, then the universal, which it's a subset of, must also have that property. So that logically follows. But what does that actually mean for what we're experiencing around us? Does that mean that sports teams or governments and nations are self-conscious? So then we can think, actually, there is a way to see it like that. There's a central intelligence that organizes and maintains the collective for the well-being of the whole and not just the part. So, in the ideal sense, the leader of a nation is not self-serving or in it to make their group better and well off while the rest of everyone else suffers. Rather, the proper leader is organizing things on behalf of all the constituents of that group or nation. And it's for the well-being of the whole. So there's a central intelligence which is conscious of the whole and all its constituents and is organizing those parts and managing those parts for the benefit of the whole, all the parts. So in that way, a group is self-conscious. In the same way, a sports team has a coach, right? The coach is not supposed to just be in it for their individual fame or try to promote one player or two players. They're supposed to be there and see the team as a whole and how the different individuals work together and the dynamic and organizing the dynamic better and more effectively. So in that way, the central intelligence of a team is that coach organizing the parts of the whole. So we can see how this is practical in our experience. It's not just some speculation. In the same way, organisms, right? Cells make tissues. Tissues make organs. And that's all going on within the whole of an organism as a whole. So there are so many parts or players, right? Each individual cell is a player or a citizen of the whole organism. But they're acting for the sake of that whole. And that whole is the central intelligence, which on some level is organizing the whole. At the same time, as an organism ourselves, we don't know more than half of what's going on in our own body. So the ideal leader of a nation doesn't need to know the day-to-day details of every single individual. The coach of the team doesn't need to know every single aspect of the dynamic between each of the players. It just knows enough to organize and orchestrate, and those particular relationships and the nuances are there. But the central intelligence still plays a role. There's an emphasis on that central intelligence. And that's what we mean by the whole. So in the same way, now we're going to continue to follow this development. This is the theistic conclusion of that development. All the qualities that we possess are derived from the reality of which we are part or participate. So the universal self as living, reasonable, self-conscious, and absolutely free, that's what the idea of God is. So we have all of the experiences we have as a self, which is conscious, which is alive, which can reason, which can love, that can pursue freedom. We have that capacity because we are within the context of something which has those properties itself. And we're just moments of that process. We're moments of that. We're finite moments of that infinite self. So, like we said, as the living cells in a body exist for the sake of the living organism as a whole, all individual cells exist for and serve functions of the organic whole, the universal self that is God.
So that's beautiful stuff, man.
Yeah, did you have something to add, Alex?
No, I have a few questions, but I want you to get through like your whole process, and also just for me because it's like pretty sequential, and it
Okay.
might answer my questions. Yeah.
So we only have about 4 more slides now. This is just a short section. Comprehending that the truth is the whole. So Dr. Dr. B. Madhavapuri has given this very concise and very deep, very applicable quote. Text without context is a pretext of knowledge. So now we'll just try to unpack that and give an example of it. So if we read just one part of a book, she killed her husband, then we get the idea that this lady is a murderer. Whoever she is, she's a murderer. So we're taking text, but we're not considering its context. So we arrive at this idea that she's a murderer. But then if we consider the context of the rest of the sentence or the rest of the paragraph, it says Susan's husband attacked her. In self-defense, she killed her husband. Now we have a whole different idea of what's going on here. Instead of thinking that she's a murderer, or she's just defending herself. This is a proper response. Might be a bit dramatic, but it's a proper response. So in the same way, the text, we need the context of that text. If we don't have context, it's a pretext. It's misleading. It's incomplete and misleading. So Dr. Pori also gives another quote to help drive this point home. From the reader's perspective, a book is composed of alphabetical letters, but the book itself did not originate from these letters. Ultimately, it is from the ideas of the author that the letters of the book come to be. In the same way, the molecules of a biological organism are the result, not the origin of life. This is the difference between the order in which we come to know things, ordo cognoscendi, and the order in which something comes to be, ordo essendi. So ordo cognoscendi refers to our experienced reality, or that something is, its immediate appearance. But ordo ascendi is referring to its conceptual reality or its essence, what something is. So we're making a distinction here, that something is, which is indeterminate. We're just acknowledging that it is. We don't know what it is yet. We don't have any concept of it. We don't know its context, its details. We just know something very abrupt, short, incomplete. So without proper context, a description of any phenomena is incomplete and potentially misleading. So what is the context that we're referring to here? How do we made the point, but now how do we apply that, let's say, to helping our scientific endeavor progress? So being for that, for the sake of which something exists, is its proper context. We have to ask, what is it for? What is it a function of? And this type of purpose-oriented or teleological approach restores all 4 aspects of Aristotelian causality. This is something we talked about in the very first presentation of chapter 1. So we won't get into that, but this is just connecting it back to the first presentation. And so we're trying to restore, what is the purpose of something, that which it exists for, what its function serves, what is it a function of? And as this applies to humans, we try to give this development of individual I to the universal I or the universal self, and establish that as the context which we are for, and which we are trying to reestablish our consciousness in. Our consciousness is kind of in a sleeping state when we're not aware of that broader context, and we're trying to wake up from that. So this is essentially where this presentation ends. One last point. Just as the molecules of an organism are a result, the development of the organism, the molecules of the organism are a result, which is a reciprocal whole-part relation. The individual I is also a result of a dynamic relationship between itself and the universal self. So in the beginning of all this, we started with the individual I, thinking that was a starting point. And it seemed that we arrived at the universal self from starting with the individual. But in fact, it's the individual which is a result. When we say I, that's a result. It's a result of a process, a relational process, a very dynamic and organic, living, consciousness-based process between the universal and individual. And the I is a result of that interaction. And it's a continuous process. It's not static. It never becomes isolated from the process. That's when we start going back to reductionism. We take a moment of the process, we make it frozen or static, and we study that moment in forgetfulness of that process that we removed it from. So this is something Hegel says. We have to reverse that. We have to reintegrate this static moment back into that dynamic process and see how it's connected. And this is how we can have a proper knowledge, scientific knowledge of whole and part. So this is the one photo, one graph that Dr. Pori included in the book, which basically sums up the whole thing. Right now, we are in an egocentric, false ego on the left. We think we're at the center. But in fact, we're not in the center. We're a part of something which has an absolute center. And we exist in relation to that. And we're trying to learn how to conduct ourselves and to think in that way. And again, in a very scientific way. We're not looking for the easy way out. We're looking for a very comprehensive idea, something which is all inclusive of unity and diversity at the same time. Not just unity, not just diversity, but both at the same time, how it's possible. How can we reconcile a contradiction in a higher understanding? That's the point. So, last 3 points. This is the last 3 points. Scientists want to study objects and their relationship to one another, but not to the person talking about them, i.e. the person for whom they're objects of description, the scientist or observer. Modern science is largely a pretext because it hasn't properly integrated the purposeful and consciousness-based context of phenomena. The purpose of our study is to help develop science beyond this through philosophical and religious insights. And we are at the end of our presentation.
That was dense. I feel like this is a very important part of this whole thing. For me at least, I think this is what's like blocking me from a deeper understanding of all of this. So I have a lot of questions, but I probably won't get through all of them. But I think what I want to ask is what do you mean when you say the individual? Are you referring to the I sense, or are you referring to the soul, or what is the individual and what is the I, and how are they the same thing? I don't know.
Yeah. So we can think of an individual in terms of boundaries, right?
Yeah.
So from the most immediate experiential perspective that science would agree with, the individual self is the boundary of my skin in some way, right? So now any object that I have in my hand is outside of that boundary and is a separate individual. This phone is an individual. I'm an individual. From the deeper religious perspective, which holds, and also philosophical perspective, where the body, physical stuff is not animate on its own, right? And it's also always changing, always dying. So that self is really a soul or a concept. You can use the word concept in the same way we would use soul. Hegel does that. So a soul means, so still boundaries is essential for this concept of individuality. So when we talk about souls, we mean the boundaries of consciousness. What are our desires in many ways, the boundaries of our desires. That's kind of what defines the individual of the soul. But it's essential to remember that the individual never exists independently. So when we say individual, we implicitly mean it has a connection to something beyond itself.
Right, because if it's individual, it has to be individuated from some source, right?
Exactly.
I get that. I guess I'm just struggling with the concept of the soul. Like, is the soul a cognitive process? And yeah, I'll just stop there. I'll ask you that question. What is the soul? I never can get my hand around what it is. I feel like so many religions and different, and it can get lost in translation. A lot of times I get confused.
Yeah. Can you hear us, Alex?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay. Yeah, so what is a soul?
A soul. Soul is something, something that like after a person decays, and this soul, I mean like this thing which is called soul, goes into another human body. Like this soul gets into birth and then turns into a brand new person.
Are you talking about reincarnation?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an activity of the soul.
It's called Atma.
Atma, exactly. Yeah, so in Vedanta, this is what the word for soul is, Atma. So what the acharyas or teachers of devotion tell us is that the soul is composed of three aspects: thinking, willing, and feeling.
Like for example, let's say that let's say that person's soul, like that person was a very knowledgeable person, in a math and science. So let's say that that person passed away at age of 39. And then this soul goes into another human being.
So that the soul
happened in life.
Yes. So the soul it's called Sat Chidananda in the Vedic description. Sat Chidananda, this is a description of the soul, eternally blissful and conscious. So the example, from our perspective, we can say thinking, willing, and feeling. We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have volitional. And these three aspects are the activity of the soul. We can know the soul through those three aspects of our direct experience. In the Vedas, they discuss how they give the example of the sun and the sunshine. So you have a sun orb, which is radiating sunshine. and you know the sun orb through the sunshine. The sunshine is coming through the window, and it's a part of the sun, but it's not the whole sun, right? If the whole sun was in our room, we'd have a problem. So in
Right.
the same way, the soul is not something that we are seeing, but our consciousness is like the sunshine coming off the sun orb. Our consciousness is what we're experiencing, and it's radiating from the soul. So when we say thinking, willing, feeling, these are all contents of consciousness. We're conscious of the thoughts that we have, of the desires that we have, of the things we'd like to do.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all being motivated from, you can say, our personality on some level. It's our personhood. It's the soul is personhood that
Mm-hmm.
and all these different experiences that people are navigating are manifestations of those three core aspects: their thoughts, their feelings, and their volitions or their will. And that, I mean, that's as close as we can get to saying what the soul is. Now, of course, the soul is, again, as an individual, it's a part of something bigger than itself. There's also not just Atma, but Paramatma, the super soul.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
I just thought there was Atman and Brahman, and that was it.
No.
Huh.
So, yes, Paramatma. So from Paramatma is like the higher self. In Western tradition, sometimes the word higher self is given, right?
Yeah.
So Paramatma is like the higher self. It's the aspect, it's the immanent aspect of the whole with us. Some have compared it to the Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity. The aspect of the whole, the aspect of God that is immanent in the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Brahman is described as the aspect of the absolute, which is transcendent or beyond the individual.
Right.
So,
And that's not something that's can be experienced, right? Is that something like totally outside of our realm of conception?
no,
Like is
Brahman is called all accommodating.
okay.
So everything is within Brahman.
Right.
So it's like you can think of Brahman as like a fundamental substance of reality. But
Right.
substance is not, there's more than just substance. This is
So
something
Brahman is the sun, is what you're saying in that analogy?
in some ways, yes.
It's also where the sun exists, and I guess it's everything at once. But it's just so confusing to me.
So,
But
so the absolute is in the Vedantic teachings, the absolute has three aspects itself. So Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. It's called Advaya Gyan.
okay.
Advaya Gyan. So it's described as a non-dual whole where both the differentiation and the unity of these different aspects are existing simultaneously. And it's easier to comprehend what we're talking about through the functions. So when we say
Mm-hmm.
Brahman, we mean that aspect which is all accommodating, that which everything is situated in.
Mm-hmm.
When we say Paramatma, we mean all pervading, that which is the aspect of that absolute reality, which is pervading everything, supporting everything inside each individual. It's told Paramatma
Mm-hmm.
exists in the heart of every living individual and within the core of every atom. And then the third aspect, Bhagavan, that is the aspect which is personal. This is the aspect which is most essential. That
Is personhood
self-consciousness is what we mean by personhood. Self-conscious.
consciousness? Okay. So is self-consciousness a product of mental processes, or is it something that transcends mental processes? Like, where does the
Aristotle.
brain come in to this? And
So
I know that, yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just, I was just gonna say, like, I get confused between like the brain's function in this, because I know that, like, this is the problem. This is where I get so confused, because I know that in a reductionist point of view, the brain is where all mental processes, where the I sense comes from, where the emotions and thoughts, even though that, like, the hard problem of consciousness is that how do I know, or how am I able to experience what happiness feels like? So it's incomplete in that way. But I'm just confused as to how these all interrelate, how the brain relates to the eye sense. Is the soul, like, it's just very confusing. You know what I mean? It's I
So
can't articulate it all because there's so many things I want to say at once.
this is why this the presentation here was trying to talk in terms of part and whole.
Right, yeah.
So whenever, I mean, all the terminology that we were just using from the Vedas, from the Vedic philosophy, the most essential comprehension is that of the whole. You know, the different aspects of the
Right.
whole, as Brahman, Paramatma, Bhagavan, we don't need to really concern ourselves with that right now.
Okay.
The idea is that there is a whole. Reality exists as a whole, as an independent whole. That whole is independent, right? The concept of the absolute is that it doesn't depend on anything outside of itself. And all dependent phenomena that we experience in our finite experience always depends on something outside of itself. So there must be something which is independent, which does not rely on something outside of itself, which is at the
Right.
most fundamental ground or base for all those aspects of reality that exist based on something outside of himself. There must be something which is independent as the cause of all causes.
Right. I see that.
And that's what we mean by the whole.
Right.
Because when we experience living wholes, they develop the parts that we like to study in isolation. They
Mm-hmm.
rely on that whole. They're a part of the development of the whole. Right? The heart, the lungs, the
Mm-hmm.
eyes, they grow with the whole. So in order to have a comprehensive understanding of what they are, it needs to be in relation to that whole. So now when we want to get into the questions about what is the brain, how does the brain
Mm-hmm.
relate to the soul?
Is
How does the brain relate to consciousness? These are all questions about the parts of reality, and they
right.
must be understood in relation to that whole. Always,
Mm-hmm.
everything has to be connected back to the whole. Right? So the brain, the body, is itself composed in our experience of the body. It's all any words that we have to describe the details of our body. Those words are referring to thoughts, right? You want to describe the brain, the different parts of the brain or the different functions of the brain. This is all going on within the activity of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? The experience of the whole field of science is going on in consciousness. Our physical experience, we're conscious of that physical experience. So
Right.
consciousness is more fundamental. But so the question becomes the relationship between consciousness and the content of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Whether the content of consciousness is the brain or the body or the soul. Because again, even the soul, when we talk about spirit of the soul, we're talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we're conscious of that. So it's within consciousness. Although it also goes beyond consciousness. But that, that's a different topic.
Right. Right.
When we start with this, right, when we can understand that consciousness is most fundamental, but that there is a relationship between a content and its content, the content of consciousness and consciousness itself, then we can see the structure of consciousness. There's an object and there's a subject. Right? There's an observer and there is what's observed.
Mhm.
So now you want to talk about the mind-body problem. What is the brain?
Is the brain how it appears to like a product of our mental processes through the five senses? Is that how we perceive it? It's like
That's an appearance.
Yeah, it's an appearance through the processes, the five senses. I'm not. Yeah, I think I'm kind of getting it now.
That's an appearance. So they want to start with the appearance, and they want to get to the higher order function, starting with the appearance. They want to describe. I mean, we have to think about what's really going on, right? They want to describe consciousness. They want to start by describing the brain as independent from consciousness, as a material entity independent of consciousness. Although the very descriptive activity is already going on within consciousness, but they have to ignore that, right? So first they have to ignore that, and then they have to posit that there is this independent existence of a brain, and then they have to speculate that the physical activity of this brain is producing something which is non-physical.
Yeah.
And they do
Which is
that
very
by
difficult.
they do that by describing correlations between experiential phenomena and the neurons firing, right? They call neural correlates of consciousness. So they say when we hit you on the knee and you feel pain, you're feeling pain, but we're also watching these groups of neurons light up. So now we want to say that because we're observing a correlation, that there's causation. We want to say because these neurons are lighting up when you're experiencing pain consciously, so that means that these neurons are causing the pain. These neurons are causing your consciousness. So that's a giant leap from correlation to causation. That's what we were talking about last time, right? Mistaking the map for the terrain.
Right.
There's a correlation.
Exactly.
There's a correlation, but that's that's not the actual thing. Rather, it's a model of the real.
It's just the model.
It's a model.
It's not it doesn't fully explain like how that happens, how those neurons are doing that thing, and it's just saying that when X process happens, these neurons light up and this happens. It doesn't tell you anything more than that.
No, it doesn't. So like Hegel suggested before, by acknowledging what happens through the reductionist approach, then we can reconstruct what not to do, right? So by acknowledging that the content of consciousness is alienated from consciousness, as separate from consciousness, and then consciousness forgets about itself and takes the content as real, independent of consciousness, right? So that's the first step of what's done. Everything is happening in consciousness. Everything is content of consciousness. And in that conscious activity, consciousness is projecting its content outside of itself. Then consciousness is accepting that the content has priority over the consciousness itself. And then the consciousness is forgetting that it made that decision. So it's becoming self-forgetful. It's still conscious because that's its nature is to be conscious, but it's forgetting the whole process of projecting the content, assuming that it's primary, and then forgetting about itself. That whole process it disappears. And now you just have a consciousness that doesn't know itself and what it's conscious of as being accepted as the primary reality. And now it's trying to explain itself through that content which is assumed to be outside of itself.
Oh, so I see the problem.
Right?
Yeah.
So
That's
so
hilarious. Yeah.
so the process of forgetfulness that needs to be remembered in every aspect of science that has produced reductionistic explanations of nature, and then as a result, reductionistic explanations of conscious entities. And through reconstructing that and properly situating it in the context of conscious activity, then we can move towards what is the science of spirit, what is beyond consciousness.
Right.
Because consciousness, now when we say consciousness, we're talking about a finite consciousness. Still, there's the problem of it must depend on something outside of itself. Within consciousness, we still find mystery. Consciousness can be conscious of mystery, but it can't go into that mystery. It remains a mystery. That's the concept of mystery. But it's only a mystery because consciousness is finite on the individual scale. But beyond that,
On the individual
scale, right? But
right.
beyond
We
that,
can't know beyond that. Right. I got what you're saying.
yeah. So beyond that is the universal level. And that universal level is infinite. That mystery, that mystery of individual consciousness is its relationship. So it's actually another layer of forgetfulness. So Dr. Pori said there has to be two wounds that are healed. One is between consciousness and the world, and the other is between consciousness and God. So the first thing we described is the wound between consciousness and the world. That consciousness forgot its own activity in projecting its content outside of itself, forgetting itself, and then trying to find out about itself through that external content it's assuming is fundamental. That's the injury between the world and consciousness. And then so we got past now that injury. But now we're still in the realm of consciousness, and we can't get beyond its finite limitations of mystery. We can't get beyond that mystery. So that's the wound between the finite individual and the infinite context of God. That consciousness as individual is only a moment of that universal consciousness. And the mystery is that relationship which is not yet known. But once it becomes situated in that relationship, that mystery really becomes, it still exists because the finite can never know everything, but by knowing the whole, it knows everything indirectly, and it knows that it's a part of everything, and it knows that it's in relation to that whole. So rather than the mystery being something like, just completely outside of our realm to grapple with, it becomes something which enhances love between the individual and the universal. That mystery is leading us deeper into inquiring about the whole. And we'll never get to the conclusion of the inquiry, but we can make progress on it. And that's an eternal progress. And that's the eternal life of the soul as an individual in relation to the universal soul that is God. So that mystery becomes that which propels the process of deepening love, of deepening service, of deepening devotion. And that's what the Vedas describe as the Atma becoming reestablished in its eternal position as Jivera Svarupoi Krishnara Nityadas, as an eternal servant of Krishna. So healing those two wounds, first between the world and consciousness, and then between the consciousness and God. And in that way, just here in this very rudimentary conversation we're having, we can start to see the details kind of revealing themselves through reason, right? Now we're following a reason that is based on necessity. We're not, these are not just hypothetical speculations contingently being strung together, right? More truth is being revealed as you continue to go deeper into that relationship and the unfolding of concepts as they exist within the context of that whole, as we are participants in that. And the more that we recognize we're participants of that, the more we can know, actually. So something like that.
Yeah. Wow. That was an amazing answer. I don't even know what else to say, to be honest. Um, I just like, I think it's just, for me, it's this logical battle that I'm fighting between what I've been taught and what I know is truthful, or what I know to be, like, I'm not even sure. I'm gonna have to think a lot about this tonight because, or maybe not think, maybe I'll just like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. It's very like, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this all the time, and I have my answers and I still don't believe them, if that makes sense. And I just keep digging and digging and digging, and nothing ever changes. And then I'm like, well, does logic really have to have be is logic important in searching for God? And obviously it is. I just don't know. I don't know what I'm saying, to be honest.
Yeah, I think, the more that we deal with this together and the more that
Yeah.
I think that will help everything, because the more you
Yeah.
try to deal with it just by yourself, which obviously you're not just dealing with it by yourself, because I mean, you've been so helpful with these, coming to these meetings and
No,
supporting.
thank you.
And the more that you do that, I think the more you'll feel at ease with those kind of
Yeah.
self-grappling matches.
I think it's going to be one moment, because this is, in all of the spiritual things that I've ever gone through, and like the metamorphosis that I've been having, this is where it stops for me every time. I can't get by it. I don't know why. I just can't. And uh, so I think, like, if we continue to talk like this, it's just gonna eventually, at some time when I have proper guidance, it'll open up a little bit more for me, and then I can see it more clearly. Because still now the concepts are still like very shrouded in like my own, like, reductionist viewpoint. Because I still like, have my questions, because I've been so faithful to that materialism, religion my entire life.
Yeah.
And now it's just like breaking the veil open. And I don't know if I want it to feel real, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, because I don't know,
Well, I think the
but
more the more that we meet
it's
like
opening
this,
me up, man.
yeah,
Yeah.
the more that we meet like this and we talk and we go through this together, the more it will make sense, I think.